Hi, in this video, I'm going to show you how to do prototypal inheritance. Basically, it's doing inheritance using ECMAScript 5 as opposed to the class-based inheritance using ES 2015. To start off, I will show you these two classes using ES 2015. We have ES6 person, which is be our base class or super class, and we have another class called student, which will be our concrete class. Student is going to extend or acquire the traits from ES6 person. So that's how we're doing inheritance here. Student being the concrete class, the class that you actually instantiate, and ES6 person being the abstract or base class, which is a template for building all types of people. Notice in our base class, our ES6 person class, we put the properties name, social security number, and food. It makes sense to put it in the base class because every concrete class, whether it's a student, athlete, teacher, or whatever the class may be, they're all going to have name, a social security number, or maybe a food that they particularly enjoy. So instead of stating that on every single class file, it's better just to put it in the one class, the base or abstract class ES6 person. So that's why we have those properties or member variables there. Also keep in mind that this is ES6 again, and we're using the extends keyword to indicate inheritance, which means in this case, the student object is going to acquire the traits of the ES6 person object. The next thing I want to do is recreate this scenario using prototypal inheritance. As you can see here, we already have the base class created, the ES5 person class. So now, using the prototype creational design pattern, I'm going to create a student class. The next thing I want to do is recreate this scenario using prototypal inheritance. As you can see here, we already have the base class created, the ES5 person class. So now, using the prototype creational design pattern, I'm going to create a student class. The first thing we need to do is create the namespace. So we have student ES5 equals function, self-executes, and inside there, this is where we start building the actual object. We have the constructor function and the two properties, ID and degree. Notice that this mimics what we did using the class-based structure up here on lines 19, class student. The next thing we have to do is the actual inheritance. Notice again, back on the classical base way of doing it, we have class student extends ES6 person. We have the keyword extends. Well, how do you do that here using prototypal inheritance? There is no keyword extends, but yet somehow we got to attach this class, the student ES5 class, to the ES5 person class. We got to show inheritance without using the keyword extends. Well, the way you do that using prototypal inheritance is you're going to copy one prototype to the other. So basically what we want is the student's prototype to equal the same thing as the ES5 person. I want the prototypes to match. And then once they equal each other, from that point and going forward, we can add on to it. So how do you make the two prototypes equal each other? The answer is actually pretty simple. More importantly is the location of this line of code. You must make sure you do it as the first line of code within your namespace closure or right above the constructor function. So here's a student ES5 constructor function. This is the concrete class, the class you actually instantiate. This is where you want to write the code that establishes inheritance, which is student ES5.prototype equals object.create. And now what you want to put here is the class that you're trying to acquire the traits from, or the class that you're trying to extend, which in this case is ES5 person and its prototype. So let's check out this line of code one more time. All you're saying here is I want the student's prototype to equal the person's prototype. So student ES.prototype equals the prototype of the person. So one line of code, you have established inheritance using prototypal inheritance. Even though we have established inheritance, we still have one more problem to take care of. Notice back in our classical technique, we have the keyword super. When you actually instantiate the student, what you want to happen, and this is important, that you want the constructor of the student to execute, but at the same time, you also want the constructor of ES_person to execute. If you don't put line 21 there, it won't happen. So when you instantiate student, in other words, you go var my student equals new student, it's going to run the constructor of the student, but it won't run the constructor of the class that it extends, not by default. But look at the code here. That means this code's not going to execute. So if you instantiate student and the class that it extends, its constructor doesn't execute, then none of these properties are going to get assigned and you're going to have some issues. Using ES 2015, you can just write the word super. Now notice we have the argument in. Well, that needs to get passed on to the super class, which is a class that you extend, which is the actual name. But we got to do that same technique using the prototypal inheritance process. So we're going to go back here to our concrete class, our student class, and kind of imitate the keyword super. Again, using ES5, that word doesn't exist. What we do instead is write ES5, or the superclass, dot call, parentheses this, and any arguments that might be provided or needed in the constructor. In this case, just one, which is n. While I'm thinking about it, I'll put a confirmation that this concrete student class actually indeed got instantiated. So console log student ES5 created. Let's get ready to run this. Let's check out our self-executing function. Right now the code that we have is var ES6 student equals new student, and then we console log the name of that student, which should be Bob ES6. So let's go ahead and check that out. I'll go to our browser. We run this, and notice what we have here. We have two constructors running. The ES6 person created and the ES6 student created. That's important to note. We go back to our code and check out the one line that's instantiating. We're saying var ES6 student equals new student. But since there's inheritance involved, two constructors are running. The concrete class, again, that's the class that you actually instantiated, which is a student, its constructor is running, and so is the class that it's extending. So let's go look at this again in ES6. Here is the concrete class, here's the student class. That constructor runs, and it says student created, ES6 student created. And then at the same time, the class that it extends, ES6 person, its constructor runs. What's making the ES6 person constructor run is this line of code right here, the super parentheses and close parentheses. That's what it's allowing the super's constructor to run when you instantiate the student. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing for our prototypal inheritance. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down. Let's instantiate one of our ES5 objects. So var ES5 person equals new student ES5. Let's go to our browser and run this. And notice the last two console logs is verifying that we indeed have instantiated our ES5 student, and both constructors did run. The concrete, the student class, and the class that it extended, which is ES5 person. So I'm going to go ahead back to our code here. Let's do a quick review. To do prototypal inheritance using ES5, you have to do a couple things. One is line 50. We have to set the prototype of the concrete class to equal the prototype of the class that you're extending. That's what you're doing on line 50. Furthermore, you're going to have to call the constructor function explicitly from the concrete class. On line 54, we're saying call the constructor function. We didn't have to specify the word constructor or the actual name of the function. It's assumed if you don't put a name of a function there. So you're saying call the constructor function of ES5 person and send it this information. So this is how you call the constructor function using ES5 by invoking the call method.